Bagger riders may have the best use for air suspension because honestly, their loads vary so much, anywhere from single up riding to 2 up with a load. And air suspension is gonna give you the option to not only adjust your ride height, but basically adjust your spring rate. So today we're gonna be putting on the Legends Air Ace system on our 2020 Road Glide. This is a really simple installation with basic hand tools that you can do in your garage. This installation is gonna be the same for all Milwaukee 8 baggers and even some of the Rushmore models before that. All right, we're gonna get started on our Road Glide. The first thing we're gonna do is take off our seat, we're gonna take off our bags, and then we're gonna need a T27. We're gonna go over here to the left side switch housing. We're gonna take this clamp off and put on our control for our air suspension. Okay, so I'm gonna take a T27. I'm gonna take these 2 screws out of our perch here. It should basically stay where it's at. It shouldn't lose anything. And we're gonna replace it with this switch from Legends that'll ultimately be the up and down control of our air suspension. But when we do this, normally I would probably run this wire inside these bars. We're gonna change these bars, so I'm actually not gonna run it inside of here just yet. After that, you need to route the wire in this channel where the tank is, all the way back to this area here where the ECM is. I'm just gonna take a 1/2 inch and loosen up our tank, kind of raise it up so I can run it underneath there. If you wanted to remove your tank to like add it to the stock wiring harness, you could. We actually have a video on how to take your tank on and off, and I'll add that link into the description. So you have to line this peg right here up with this cutout in the new clamshell piece. And what you may run into is when you first put this up here, when you line that peg up, you might not be able to move this over far enough to where it lines up with the switch housing and lines up with the holes you have to thread into. That's not a big deal. Take a T25, there's 2 screws on the back of the switch housing here. All you need to do is loosen them up just a little bit, and you can move this over so this all moves into place. As you can see, ours isn't lined up. I'm gonna loosen those T25s. I'm gonna scoot this back over, put these screws in and tighten everything up. Yet another reason to change handlebars. So the next thing we're gonna do is plug in and route the rest of our wiring harness. First thing we need to do is take the fuse out of here. Then we're going to plug the wire we ran from the handlebar into this lone black plug right here. That's gonna leave us with this gray and black set of plugs here. And after we've hooked our positive and negative to our battery, we're gonna run these down this side of the bike following the wiring harness, and we're basically gonna end up with these kind of in between the bottom of the motor and the transmission where the compressor is gonna be. But to do all that, we have to take this ECM bay kind of apart, take that little holder out. It's a 1/2 inch, 2 bolts. We'll flip that up out of the way so we can access our battery and get this thing mounted. Here's our fuse, which we need to take out. So there's this metal tab sticking through a slot on the tray that's holding the ECM. We want to be able to get that off there, so you gotta push it forward and kind of pull it up around the slot. Now to make that a little easier, these plugs right here are snapped down into this ECM tray. We're just gonna pull them loose off of there. You don't have to unplug them if you don't want to. We can just pop them loose. That's gonna make it easier for us to push this forward and to lift this tray up and then lay it over that way. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these two plugs and I'm gonna run them down here. You can see daylight. You'll probably have to take your side panel off. We'll run these down towards that side of the bike. We get them pulled through, then we'll go ahead and attach our positive and negative to our battery and put our ECU tray back. So I'm gonna close this all back up, put the ECM tray back in there, but make sure you don't put the fuse back in the harness just yet. I'm gonna leave that fuse routed over the top of the ECM tray, and then later on we'll come back and put that fuse back in when we're ready to test the system. But for now, we're gonna button this up, and then we're gonna have to move to the bottom side of the bike. So I can get to it. So now we're gonna mount the compressor, and where it mounts is underneath the bike, basically in between the back of the engine case and the front of the transmission case. And it mounts like this, with all of this from the compressor housing pointing towards the back of the bike. And each side of it's gonna be held up on the frame rail by these two kind of built-in clamps. There's a 5/32 Allen here and a 7/16 bolt here. You have to loosen those up to get them on the frame rail. But before you mount it, plug in the wires that we ran down here so you don't have to plug them in later. And let's plug in the air hose that comes with it and route it towards the top of the bike back to the battery compartment. When you plug this in, this is just a push-in fitting. It'll push right in there. Make sure you have a nice clean end cut off nice and straight. They give you a nice cutter. Make sure when you put it in that cutter, it's not angled. You want a straight cut on there. And then when you push this in, just push it in. And if you have to release it, you just pull back on the fitting, it'll release the hose right out of there, kind of like Chinese handcuffs. I'm running the air hose back along the same route as the wiring harness because I didn't want to run it next to the belt on the other side. When you run this air hose, give yourself plenty of room and don't make any tight bends. Make sure they have nice kind of loopy bends. That way you won't get any kinks. Okay, I've taken both of the clamps off. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the clutch side in first with this compressor part. It kind of sits up in here. We're gonna put that in first. I'm gonna start that clamp and just leave it so it's holding everything there. Then come around to the other side of the bike and then get that clamp started and then tighten them both up. Okay, now that that's all secured, we're gonna move back up top and we're gonna actually install the shocks. So for this, you're gonna wanna have something where you can block up the bike. A flat jack is probably your best option. Otherwise, get some blocks or a buddy or something. You're gonna need to hold onto your bike so you can put the shocks on. You're gonna need a 3/4 inch socket to pull the shocks off. And when we put these back on, it comes, the new air suspension comes with spacers. And it's gonna be spacer on the inside, one of their supplied washers on the outside, and then the stock bolt goes back in, and it gets torqued anywhere from 63 to 70 foot-pounds. It's important to use their spacer on the inside and their small washer on the outside. And do not reuse this big flat washer that's on here because their washer sits on the inside of here and it has these swivel type fittings. So use the hardware like we explained it. Don't use this stock washer, just a stock bolt, torqued to 63 to 70 foot-pounds. And I want to say something else, even before we get any of the airlines hooked up, it's very important when you go to test your system, I'm saying this now well ahead of time, to put the bike back on the ground and have weight on the rear wheel, let it all the way down. If you don't, if you start running these air shocks with no weight on this, you could pinch this the inside of this air shock and it'll void your warranty. So make sure before we even get to testing these that you put this bike back down after you have these installed. So when we put the shock on, you want to orientate it so your air fitting is facing forward and the silver label down here is on the inside, which is going to put your adjustment facing back. The silver label to the inside, your air adjustment to the front, and it's going to look about like that right there. Washer. So now that our shock's installed, we're gonna go back to the brake side of the bike and we're gonna finish running our air lines. We have the air line ran up in the side panel of the bike. We're actually gonna put in a Y or a splitter there, run a short piece to one shock, and then run another piece over here to this shock. And remember to put that bike all the way down before we do any testing. So we have our little splitter piece. I'm actually gonna split it right here under this cover, and then I'm gonna run a short piece over here to this shock, and I'm gonna run another piece across under the seat area to the other shock. I'm just gonna zip tie those so they're not banging around or getting pinched. While I'm doing that, I'm gonna go back and zip tie our wire harness line and our air line to some of the stock wiring harness here to make sure we're all buttoned up, and then we'll test the shocks. So now our install's done. We're gonna flip the ignition on the bike. We're gonna fill everything up with air, run it up and down, make sure nothing's getting pinched anywhere. If we're all good, we'll get the bike all buttoned back up and we'll talk about settings. So the install is pretty much just as simple as that, but as far as how to set this up for getting down the road, obviously up on the handlebar, the up and down is gonna help you set ride height, but here on the shock, you can actually control your rebound dampening. There's a numbering system on there, 1 through 6. The higher the number, the stiffer the ride. There's a little dot on the shock that you're gonna line your number up with. I recommend starting that at number 3, riding your bike, see how you like it. If you wanna go stiffer, increase the number, and conversely, if you want a little bit softer, go ahead and go down in the number. All we have left to do is button up our bike. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop us a comment and go work on those motorcycles.